Hello everyone, welcome to Easy Economics. How are you all doing? I hope you all are doing good. Today I brought for you all October-November 2025 0455 paper 12. We're going to be solving MCQs today. So let's quickly see what this paper has brought for us today. MCQ number 1. MCQ number 1 says a government wants to build a new hospital. What is most likely to prevent the government from doing this? So now they are asking, why is not a government able to construct a hospital? A says people in the country cannot afford healthcare. B says people in the country would go abroad for healthcare. C says the government cannot agree how big the hospital should be. And D says the government does not have enough money. So now the question is asking us to identify the difficulties in order for the government to construct that hospital, right? So you need to identify the hurdle which is preventing the government from constructing that hospital. So that means it should be lack of resources or funds, right? So part option number D says the government does not have enough money. That's the correct answer. So we'll shade in D as the correct response. Why it can't be the other options? It's because A says people in the country cannot afford healthcare. So that's the only reason why the government should be providing it, right? But then here we are asking from the government's perspective, not from the people's perspective. So we're going to chop A. Again, people in the country would go abroad for healthcare. They would go abroad for healthcare if the government is unable to provide it or if they have resources. But we're talking about the government. Again, you will chop B because A and B doesn't make sense. C said the government cannot agree how big the hospital should be. But this should not prevent the government from making it. Right? That comes after it. But when the government is not able to make it, that means it's short on its funds. It doesn't have the resources, right? Scarce resources, scarcity. MCQ number 2. All right, on my right, this is the bubble sheet which you would be getting in your CIEs, and you would need to shade in your responses for each MCQ. I hope you all are familiar with this sheet. All right, MCQ number 2. Which firm describes the loss of potential benefit to a consumer when making a choice between alternatives? So now they are asking you to identify the term which they are asking you to identify the term which you can identify after reading this sentence. When making a choice between alternatives, what does a person forgoes? What cost does the person incurs? Right? Opportunity cost. Right? This is what a person incurs. Right? Opportunity cost is the cost of the best alternative foregone when a choice is made. So whenever a choice is made by a person, what cost incurs? Opportunity cost. Right? So for 2, it has to be A. Number 3. MCQ number 3 shows a production possibility curve. Now they are saying initially the country was at a position X on the PPC and it was producing capital goods and consumer goods. Then a recession came. Now what happens in a recession? The aggregate demand falls. The overall productive capacity of an economy falls. So now what happens? The factory is closed. So when the factory is closed, what should happen? The production should fall, both for capital goods and consumer goods. Now they're saying how would this situation be represented in a PPC now? After the factory has been closed and a recession has been witnessed by the economy, how would this be depicted in terms of the PPC? Which position would now show this? It should be shown by a shift of the PPC inwards. Why? Because for both capital and consumer goods, less are now going to be produced because the country is witnessing a recession, a slowdown, right? A reduction in its productive capacity. So when the productive capacity falls, the output should fall. So when the output level falls, the output level shrinks, the PPC should shift inwards. And that is shown only by point C. So for 3, we'll shade in C. Number 4. Number 4 gives us a table. They say which combination gives correct examples both for macro and microeconomics. So you need to pick that option which satisfies both parts of the equation, macro and micro. So macroeconomics is what? The study of the aggregates, and micro is what? The study of the individual market. So when we are studying the specific markets, that's micro, and when we are talking about the economy as a whole, then it is macro. So when you look at the options, the only correct option is C. So for number 4, we'll shade in C as the correct response. There are certain MCQs for which you need to be crystal clear about the definition of the concept, and you do not even need to look at the options. You can easily identify and save your time to solve in either the numerical questions or the questions which are a little tricky, right? All right, I hope so far it's clear. Number 5. MCQ number 5 displays a demand and a supply diagram for a good. The initial market equilibrium is given at point E1. Now they are saying there's a change in the market that leads to a new equilibrium at E2. Now they're saying we don't know what happened, but something happened which has caused the demand. There must have happened something to the demand curve. That is why now the equilibrium position is at E2. So this is E2. So what happened? The demand curve rose towards the right, right? So now what must have caused the demand to increase? Why did the demand curve shifted towards the right, displaying an increase? What is the cause? Option A says a decrease in the price of a substitute. If the price of a substitute would have fallen, so the demand of this product should have fallen and not rising. So we'll chop A. B says a decrease in the raw material prices. If the raw material prices are falling, so this would be related to the supply and not the demand. C says an increase in the price of a substitute. If the price of a substitute good rises, yes, then the consumers would shift towards this product and the demand for this product is going to rise. So for 5, it has to be C. MCQ number 6. MCQ number 6 displays a downward sloping demand curve. The vertical axis shows price and the horizontal axis displays quantity. Now they are saying what can be concluded about a single downward sloping demand curve. What is this diagram showing? Consumers increase demand when their incomes rise? Not necessarily. That depends upon the nature of the product, right? That depends on the nature of the product. Consumers plan to buy less when prices rise. C says firms produce less as prices rise, firms sell more when prices rise. We are talking about the demand curve. So C and D is related to the supply curve. We'll chop C and D. A is not a necessary situation. The correct answer is B by logic. And also, it's correct. Why? Because a downward sloping demand curve shows that when the prices are low, consumers tend to buy more, right? And when the prices are high, consumers tend to buy less. That is why the demand curve is downward sloping, and that is the nature of the law of demand. So for MCQ number 6, we'll shade in B as our correct response. MCQ number 7. MCQ number 7 is asking us to calculate price elasticity of supply. By formula, we know price elasticity of supply is equals to percentage change in quantity supplied upon percentage change in price. So, how much change is being shown by percentage change in quantity supplied? That's a 20% increase. And percentage change in price is again a positive 10%. When you divide the two, the answer should be a +2. And that's your answer. So for MCQ number 7, we'll shade in D as our correct answer. MCQ number 8. How are economic decisions determined in a market economy? We know in a market economy, the decisions are made by the forces of demand and supply. So for 8, we'll shade in D. It cannot be A because A talks about a mixture of market forces and government intervention, which is mixed economy. So we'll swap in A. B talks about central planning, which means we are talking about a planned economy or a command economy. So we'll chop in B because here we want market economy. C is again by government regulation of the price mechanism. No, the government doesn't regulate the price mechanism when we talk about the market economy. So by default and by logic, for MCQ number 8, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. MCQ number 9. For MCQ number 9, they've given us a table, and the table is showing costs and benefits of constructing a bridge. They're saying a bridge is built over a river. What calculation represents social benefit? We know social benefit is what? Private benefit plus positive externalities or external benefit. Private benefit plus the positive externalities or the external benefit. So how much was the private benefit? 12. How much was the external benefit? 8. 12 add 8 should give you 20. So 20,000 is the correct answer. So for MCQ number 9, we'll shade in D as our correct answer. MCQ number 10. What is not a role of the central bank? So this means out of these 4 options, 3 would be the correct answers. Only there would be one option which is not being performed by a central bank. Acting as a lender of the last resort, issuing notes and coins, managing the gold reserves of the country. These are all the functions which a central bank performs. They are asking what is not being performed. To hold deposits for the general public, from the general public. This is the role of the commercial bank. So this is not being performed by a central bank. So for MCQ number 10, we'll shade in B. I hope so far things are clear. Moving forward, MCQ number 11. The table shows the proportion of disposable income spent on 3 different goods by 4 different households. So now they are saying how much income is being spent by 4 different families on these 3 goods: food, transport, and holidays. What's the question? Which household has the least income? The household which spends most on food and the least on holidays. Why? Because holidays is supposed to be what? Leisure. So the house that spends least on leisure and most on food is supposed to be earning the lowest income. So which household spends least on holidays? A. And it's spending the most on food, 50%. So this household earns the lowest income. So for MCQ number 11, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 12. MCQ number 12 talks about in which occupations do wages tend to be the lowest. Now, what would be the nature of the occupation in which the wage rate would be least? In those where the work is dangerous. If the work is dangerous, the labor should be demanding high wages. So we'll chop A. In those where there's an excess supply of labor, yes, that's the correct answer. Because when supply exceeds demand, the bargaining power of the workers is low or the labor is low, and the wages would be lower. Why? Because if they won't hire you, they've got multiple options, right? If you are demanding high wages, they've got multiple options, multiple substitutes. So for 12, we'll shade in B. Why it can't be C and D? Because again, C and D are talking about a situation contrary to what they are asking. In C and D, both the wages should be high, because if you are belonging to a trade union or if you are talking about a job that needs a lot of training, so the wage rate should be high. So for 12, we'll shade in B as the correct response. MCQ number 13. MCQ number 13 says, how might a trade union increase its bargaining power? How do you think a trade union would grow in its power? By expanding the market for the product. B says by increasing the cost of union membership for workers, by restricting the entry of workers to the industry, by supporting wage claims in other industries. So for MCQ number 13, we'll shade in C, because if the trade union is able to restrict the entry of workers to the industry, it will not allow workers to easily enter, and it will enforce the firms to pay higher or listen to their demand. So for MCQ number 13, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. MCQ number 14. To be able to produce a car tire, rubber is required. That's the key raw material. So if a car tire manufacturer, so now he's the one who produces it, he merges with the supplier of a rubber. So he's going back to the sources of supply. So if a tire manufacturer merges with the sources of his supply, this is what? This is vertical integration backwards, right? This is vertical integration backward. It cannot be horizontal integration, because horizontal integration is if a car tire manufacturer would have merged with a car tire manufacturer. It cannot be internal, because we are talking about merging with an external supplier, right? It cannot be a conglomerate, because conglomerate is when you are merging with an entirely two different business. But when he's going back towards the sources of supply, we are talking about a vertical integration backwards. So for 14, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. MCQ number 15. When it produces 100 units, a firm's total variable cost is 300 and the fixed cost is $2,700. What is the average total cost? So first we'll calculate the total cost. The total cost is equals to variable cost plus fixed cost. Variable cost was 300, fixed cost was 2,700. We'll add the two, that would be $3,000. That's the total cost, right? Average total cost is what? Total cost divided by total output, right? How much was the total cost? 3,000. How much was the total output? 100. So 3,000 divided by 100 is giving you what? $30. So for 15, D is the correct answer. $30 per unit. That's the average total cost. All right, moving forward. MCQ number 16. What is likely to be found when there are many small firms in an industry? So what do you think should be the situation? There are few barriers to entry, there is high expenditure on R&Ds, there is little competition, very large capital costs are needed to establish a firm. It cannot be B, it cannot be C, it cannot be D. Why? Because there's a lot of competition if there are small firms. We'll chalk C. Large capital costs are not required, that is why so many firms are able to enter. We'll chalk D. High expenditure on research and development, small firms cannot make high expenditure on R&Ds. So we'll chop B, C, and D. So by logic, we've eliminated and we are left with A. But then why A? There are few barriers to entry. Obviously, there are few barriers to entry. That is why even a small firm is able to enter the market easily, and there are so many small firms competing against each other, right? So for 16, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. We're through with half of the paper. I hope things are going smooth for all of you and you all are understanding and comprehending and are with me. MCQ number 17. MCQ number 17 says a government imposes tariffs on imported goods. A government is imposing taxes on imported items. What is not a reason for this? So why do you think a government would not be imposing a tariff? So out of these four options, there would be one reason which would not apply to this situation. To boost domestic output, that would be a reason, because the government wants its population or its consumers to demand locally manufactured products. So you'll chop A. To influence the country's balance of payment, that could be the intention of the government, because it wants to improve the scenario of the BOP. It wants to reduce imports and improve exports. Maybe it wants to reduce the deficit or improve the current account surplus. So we'll chop B. To protect domestic employment, that could be a reason, because the government wants to increase the levels of employment by increasing the demand for the domestically produced goods. So we'll chop A, B, and C. So by elimination and by logic, we are left to D. To reduce the exports from the country. Obviously, we never impose tariffs to reduce exports. We impose taxes to cut down on imports and to boost exports. I'll repeat. We impose taxes so that people demand less imports and switch to exports, right? So for 17, we'll shade in D. If you're confused, always read the question 2 times and the situation will get better. All right. MCQ number 18. gives us a table. It talks about how much revenue the government is collecting in a year. So it displays taxes on goods, taxes on income, taxes on services, and customs and excise duties. What is the question asking? How much is the government earning by way of indirect tax revenue? Indirect tax revenue is what? When people spend, right? By way of goods and services. So taxes on goods, taxes on services, and customs and excise duties. We'll add these three. Taxes on income is what? That's a direct tax. So we'll not take this. So we'll add 30, we'll add 20, and we'll add a 50. So we'll be left with what should be the total? $100 million. So for 18, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. Right, students? All right, moving forward. MCQ number 19. Which policy measure would be classified as fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is when we are talking about government expenditure and taxes. Changes in interest rates and money supply. When we talk about money supply and interest rates, that monetary policy. Changes in the labor market policies to encourage more training. This is supply side policy. Changes in tax rate and government spending. Exactly. So for 19, we'll shade in C. MCQ number 20. What is the most likely result of a fall in interest rates? So what happens if interest rates fall? A fall in inflation, a fall in investment, a rise in consumer spending, a rise in saving. So if interest rates fall, what happens? People are going to be, if interest rates fall, what is going to be happening? Inflation would increase because people will be spending more. So we'll chop A. And investment would fall because hot money inflows would not come in, right? A rise in consumer spending. Yes, consumers would be spending more because saving would fall and spending would rise. Saving would fall and spending would rise. So C is the correct answer and D is incorrect because saving would fall and not rise. So for 20, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. MCQ number 21. What causes a successful supply side policy increase in an economy? The level of unemployment, the production possibilities, the rate of inflation, the rate of interest. Production possibilities, because supply side policy is what? When we are increasing the productive capacity of the economy, right? So the supply side policy would be successful if the economy is able to increase its productive capacity, right? The entire aim of a supply side policy is to boost the productive capacity, and it would be successful once it has done that. So by definition, it satisfies B, so we'll shade in B option. Number 22. In a one particular year, South Sudan's population growth was 1.3, while the GDP was 2%. What is most likely consequence of this? So what would happen? GDP grew by 2%. Population grew by 1.3%. So the real GDP grew by how much? 0.7%. So by 0.7%, the real GDP grew. This means what? Standard of living increase, right? Or the real income rose. So what happens? The standard of living increase, right? GDP per capita did not decrease, it must have increased. The rate of inflation will decrease, not necessarily. Unemployment will increase, unemployment should decrease because the people are better off, right? So for 22, the correct answer is C. 23. What are the correct definitions of unemployment and employment relative to the number of people of working age? So unemployment is what? The people want to work but are unable to find job at the current wage rate, right? And employment is what? Those who have a job at the current wage rate, right? So for 23, it has to be B. right? Those who want a job but aren't able to find one, that's unemployment. And those who have a job at the current wage rate, that's employment. So for 23, it's B. MCQ number 24. MCQ number 24 shows the average price level changes in the average price level. It's showing a graph. The vertical axis is displaying the changes in the price, and the horizontal axis is displaying the year. Now notice what happens. In year 0, there was 2% change. Then after 1.5 year, the change price level rose from 2 to 3%. Then the rate started falling, but it was still positive after 3.5 years. It was still positive. So the x-axis is displaying what? That up till year 3.5, the inflation rate was what? Inflation was still rising, right? The question is asking, when did the country experience deflation? First, tell me what is deflation. Deflation is negative inflation, or you can talk about it as a sustained fall in price, a continuous, a sustained fall in price. So, what happens? It's when this means what? Deflation means where the inflation rate is negative, that means below the zero line graph. That means the prices are falling. Above the above the x-axis, what was happening? What was happening? Prices were still rising, even though the rate was falling, but the prices were still rising. But what is happening below the x-axis? That the prices are falling, and this is where deflation lies, where the prices are falling. So when is that happening? Between year 4 and 5. When are the prices falling? Between year 4 and 5. Here. So for 24, we'll shade it in D. I hope it's clear. MCQ number 25. In high income economies, increasing income inequality has led to greater poverty. So when there is a greater disparity between the higher income and the lower income groups, the poverty level rises in the economy. They are saying which policies combination would you require in order to put a stop to the income inequality. So fiscal policy should be what? And what should be happening to the supply side policy? Supply side policy should be expansionary, right? So what you should do? You should increase the national minimum wage rate, and in fiscal policy you should try to cut down, right? You should use what? Contractionary fiscal policy if you want to reduce the poverty level. The fiscal policy should be contractionary and the supply side policy should be expansionary, right? This combination should be adopted. So you should increase the inheritance tax and you should increase the national minimum wage rate to better off the situation, right? So for 25, we'll shade in C. MCQ number 26. A country has a falling birth rate. So this means its population under 16 is what? Falling. So we'll chop C and D because it's talking about rising. A rising death rate. So the death rate is rising, what? This means people of over 60 years are falling. So this means A. Also, more of the population between 16 to 60 years are going abroad for employment. So this means again the population in the middle ages between 16 to 60 is also falling. So all these three parts of the statement satisfies option A. So for 26, we'll shade in A. Number 27. What is an advantage of international specialization? So what happens when each country specializes in the production of the goods and services in which it excels or in which it has a comparative advantage? What happens? Choice is limited? No. Countries become over dependent on each other? We are talking about an advantage. This would be a disadvantage. Resources are used more efficiently, transport costs are decreased. Resources are used more efficiently, right? Because each country produces or excels that in the production of that good in which it has a comparative advantage. So for 27, we'll shade in C. MCQ number 28. MCQ number 28 says an economy raises its tariff on imported goods. So if a country imposes taxes on imported items, what happens? A fall in the rate of inflation, an increase in consumer choice, an increase in domestic production, the current account of the balance of payment moves into deficit. Now the current account would improve. So we'll chop D. An increase in consumer choice. No, the consumer choice would reduce because now the country has imposed tariffs. So we'll chop in B. A is also incorrect because inflation would increase by way of imported inflation. If it's a raw material whose price will now increase by imposing a tax, or if it's a key ingredient required in the production, right? Or maybe even a finished item. So, an increase in domestic production is the correct answer, right? Because people will switch to local production, demand for locally manufactured products will increase. So, for 28, we'll shade in C. MCQ number 29. Which combination of changes in export revenue and import expenditure is likely to cause a country's exchange rate to depreciate? When will a country's exchange rate depreciate? When its exports are less than imports. When it's spending more on imports and earning less on exports. So export revenue has to be decreasing and import revenue has to increase. So for 29, it's B. Last MCQ. 30. A government wishes to reduce the deficit on its BOP. Which policy should it adopt? Increase subsidies on exports, increase taxes on its exports, remove an embargo, remove tariffs. If it removes tariffs, if it removes embargo, the situation is going to get worse enough because it would cause more imports. If it increases taxes on exports, again, it would be difficult for the locally manufactured products to compete in the international arena. In order to improve BOP, it should boost exports, and the only way looking at these options is to provide subsidies to its locally manufactured, to its local producers, or to boost its locally manufactured products. So for 30, it has to be A. I hope you enjoyed solving this paper with me and you understood. Stay tuned, subscribe, happy learning.